Amir,
Yes.
I don't know how to give you permission.
You can press on my name.
Okay. Oh, make co-host. Is that going to work?
Yeah, that'll probably work. Yeah.
Co-host. Okay, see if that works. Khyam, I'll make you a co-host too. I don't know if that matters, but why not?
Thanks.
Oh, fuck.
Okay.
No, and fuck. Jake, I'm having a problem.
What's that?
I don't want to be a co-host because I can't record. Well, I probably can. I just don't know how. I'll find out.
Okay, maybe we can just stick with the cloud recording anyway.
Yeah, but that's just one. Okay, let's start.
Okay. Here we go. No, I apologize. Now that I'm screen sharing, I don't see the button to start.
I see. I can do it.
Okay. Thanks, Khyam. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to resume the Algorithmic Sound Series this fall, which leads me to a huge thank you to Art Science Connect at the CUNY Graduate Center, the L. Held Foundation, Peter Eckersall, and Amir Farjun for making this series happen. Our next masterclass will be on December 11th with Matthew Riles. He's a musician that makes improvisational and generative music with the modular synthesizer. Matthew will be sharing some of his techniques from his creative process. So this will be interesting for people interested in synthesis, but also people interested in algorithmic composition in general. You can register for this event on Eventbrite. For today's masterclass, I'm really happy to welcome Khyam Allami. Khyam is a multi-instrumentalist, composer, and researcher, and today he'll be telling us about his software, Apotome, and the music he makes with it. I was excited when I first discovered this project because it's such an intuitive way to incorporate microtonal tuning systems into electronic music software. Apotome fills a huge gap in the world of electronic music software and opens the door for many exciting possibilities. So Khyam, thank you for making this project free and accessible and for joining us today. Throughout the masterclass today, if you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A text box and I will read them out. However, we would like to change up the format a little bit this time and have it be a bit more of an open conversation. So to do that, we're inviting anyone to join with video and yeah, just be in the meeting and talk and have a great conversation. So if you'd like to do that, we would really love it. Please raise your hand and we will invite you to join with your video. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Khyam. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Jake, for the invite and for having me. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to see so many numbers popping up on my screen, even though I can't see you. So as Jake mentioned, please feel free to jump in with any questions or any comments, points of discussion, these kinds of things. At any point, I'm happy to just talk at you in a kind of seminar mode, which I'll try not to do so much, but it's always nicer to try and have conversations because more often than not, my experience with talking about this subject tends to bring up a lot of presumptions, I guess is the right word to use, that people have about this subject, about the technology, and particularly in general, about music making, really. So it's nice to discuss those rather than be talked at from your perspective, I guess. So I'll start with just a short introduction as to what this project is and what it's about, and share with you a short extract of some creative uses. And then I'll show you around a little bit of the software itself, and we'll do a little exercise with Jake, who has kindly volunteered to be a guinea pig, which is always fun. So let's start with Apotome. So Apotome is a kind of umbrella catch-all title for a project that I launched in collaboration with the creative studio called Counterpoint at the CTM Festival in Berlin in January of this year, January 2021. And the idea behind this project is multifaceted. At its core, it focuses on two browser-based free open access, not open source, but open access softwares that we developed called Leimma and Apotome. The tools, Leimma allows you to create and explore tuning systems in browser without the need for any other hardware or software. And Apotome allows you to create generative music based on those tuning systems, also in browser without the need for anything else. Both tools can output MIDI data, and that helps one integrate them into their workflows, but they're designed to allow access to this subject and the exploration of this subject in a very simple and intuitive and easy way. Before I talk too much about some of these ideas, I want to share with you a 3-minute clip, which is a series of extracts from creative commissions that were broadcast as part of CTM Festival in January this year. As we were developing the project and how we'd like to launch it, we invited 3 musicians, Dina Abdelwahed from Tunisia, Wahono from Indonesia, and Slickback from Nigeria, to create half-hour-long compositions using Leimma and Apotome in their own studios, integrated into their own workflows, and to film those performances to be streamed as part of the festival. We also did a live performance where I was using Apotome to send out like real-time MIDI data to a crew of wonderful musicians, synthesists here in Berlin. They were Tyler Friedman, Todd Onyx, Nina H, Enyang Ha, and we also had Lucy Railton on cello improvising with us. And they were mostly using modular setups, so I think some of you might be interested in hearing or seeing a little bit of that. All of these are on YouTube in full, but I'll just share with you a quick short extract so you get an idea. As part of the launch, I also did a half-hour presentation titled Repressed Possibilities, which was an introduction to the wider subject matter that this particular project touches upon, which ultimately is about the non-neutrality and the cultural asymmetries and the inherited biases in music technology, and how those affect ultimately the creative freedom of music makers who are not interested in 12-tone equal temperament. And we know that this is very often the case for non-Western musicians, but in my view, this is really a fundamental that is related to all kinds of music making. And that's why I try to frame it in a way that makes sense for everybody. So before I lose myself in the sound of my own voice, I'm just going to share my screen and share this video with you. Jake, please just give me a thumbs up when you can hear audio. Tuning is one of the most fundamental elements of music making, but it's also the least taught, the least understood, and the most veiled. Do we as musicians know what notes we're playing and why they sound that way? One of the major cultural and individual identifiers of music is tuning and intonation. And even though it's more relevant to non-Western musical cultures, it applies to all music. There you go. As you can very clearly tell, all four of those performances were incredibly diverse and very, very different in their approaches, both to the way that the tools were being used and to the kind of music that was being made. I forgot to mention that also when we did the live performance where I was controlling Apotome with the other performers in Berlin, we also had a composer. Her name is Fatin Kanaan, who lives in New York, and we had her also do a half-an-hour composition, but she remotely logged into my laptop where I was on site in Berlin with the musicians. She was in New York, and she logged in and controlled Apotome from her laptop. Remotely with a remote desktop connection, and it was amazing. It ran perfectly, and everything worked fine. We had a feed going back to her via Zoom, and it was wonderful. And this is what CTM were calling translocal networked performances, where multiple people in different sites were networking together and somehow trying to create something, obviously within the kind of pandemic framework. So that was something that was really interesting and enjoyable to do. I think today I'm going to try and switch things around a bit to the way I normally work, I normally do these presentations where I talk a lot at the beginning and then show some of the tools. So I'm just going to say a couple of words and then I'll take you around the tools, and maybe we can get a discussion going a little bit sooner rather than later. Most of you probably know something about tuning as a concept, but I've been really, really surprised at how many music makers I've come across who have very limited understanding of what tuning is. And I don't blame anybody for that. This is not trying to, somehow shine a light on people's whatever lack of knowledge about something, but I would instead blame education systems. I have friends of mine who have studied at Conservatoire, full 10 years of studying Western classical music, or friends who have studied in the US education system right through to master's level, and they've never encountered this subject in any shape or form. And most of us, I think, will have encountered tuning when using digital tools and music technologies as, fixing the master tuning which is changing the value of A4 equals 440 to something like 438 or 432 for everybody who thinks that's some kind of esoteric number, for want of a better word, etc. But on the other hand, those who do have an understanding or an interest in tuning often come at it from the perspective of contemporary classical, new music, experimental music, etc. And I think both of those perspectives have their what's the word? Are somehow blinded by specific knowledge that has been inherited, and somehow, over the last 40 years or more, this knowledge has really gone unquestioned, uncritiqued in a way. And the way I like to think about tuning and the way I like to explain it when somebody asks me, well, what is it? I like to think of it as the choice that an instrument maker makes or a performer makes, if they have the capability, of the exact sound that different pitches make when they perform. So, for example, if I was to give all of you pieces of wood that when you struck them with another piece of wood, they made a sound, a pitched sound that you could hear clearly. And imagine all these pieces of wood were the same length. And I said, please make me an instrument from these pieces of wood. I'd like you to think about what kind of decisions you might make in that process in order to create a musical instrument. My guess is that there are multiple perspectives, there are multiple ways of going about it. One could be doing something intuitively by ear, where you strike a piece of wood, you strike the next one, and then you make it shorter by cutting bits off or, sanding it down until you get to a sound that you like, and then you keep going and you keep going until you've done all your pieces. You might think of it visually by lining all the pieces up and doing a kind of descending or an ascending cut across all of them. You might decide to make them in a kind of trapezoid shape in the way that we see a lot of African pitch percussion instruments, or something like the marimba. You might try to find a scientific reasoning for the way that things resonate, and try to find these different scientific mathematical methods for rendering the resonance and the frequency of each piece of wood in a different way. No matter what path you take, ultimately you are creating a tuning there that can be used, because you're defining, what the notes are. And if you play, for example, a fretless instrument like the cello or the violin or a double bass or whatever, something that has this fretlessness, right? This freedom, then you're always going to be making those decisions. When you play on your own, you're going to play in a certain way. When you play with others, you're going to play in a different way, etc., etc. And that's how I like to think about tuning. When we look at the subject of tuning in literature, you search on Google, you look in Wikipedia, you're going to be confronted with so much jargon, unfortunately. And a lot of these mathematical formulas, scientific notions, things to do with the harmonic series, etc., etc. And of course, that's all valid, because that's part of the progress of the research and the development of knowledge into this subject. But what it does for me is it creates a kind of veil of inaccessibility. And the amount of musicians I've spoken to who have had an interest in this subject and then have very quickly been turned off the subject because of the overly complex nature of the way that it's represented was always saddening for me, because it really feels like this is a subject that catches people's imagination, and then it very quickly, the energy to invest in that dissipates, because it just seems like there's so many hurdles. And personally, I had the same. When I was getting into, I grew up I was born in Damascus to Iraqi parents, and I grew up in London from the age of 9. I was playing violin from a very early age, joined the school orchestra, blah, 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 blah. And then, when I was in my adolescent years, I heard Rage Against the Machine and Jimi Hendrix, etc., and got into punk rock and all these other things and started playing drums and whatever. But then I always maintained this love for home recording and the kind of DIY ethics that come with that. once I, had a computer and I was able to access tools like Sibelius, Finale, Cubase, whatever else was around at the time, I was, keen on making music using those tools. But every time I sat down, I felt like the melodies that I had in my mind were being skewed in some way, and I was being taken elsewhere, and I could never understand why. And then when I was about 24 years old, I decided to start playing the oud. This was around the same time and a direct result of the Iraq war, or let's say the invasion of Iraq by the US and the UK in 2003. And when I started studying the oud, all of a sudden it felt like, this is something that's more, that feels closer somehow. Like whatever I can hear, I can kind of find it. And by listening and practicing and studying, I started to realize, okay, there's this thing called intonation. There are these issues of tuning, and Middle Eastern music, Arabic music, Iraqi music uses different kind of tuning. All of these intervals are variable. They move around. You really have to use your ear, etc., etc. And that's because the oud, that you can see behind me, is a fretless instrument, much like the cello or the violin. So once I started to realize that there was, a really in-depth subject matter here, and I started doing the research, I realized that the tools that I was using were not allowing me that choice. And I tried to find the workarounds, and I tried to find the resources that would allow for these explorations, and they were almost inaccessible to me, not because they were inaccessible financially or because I couldn't download them or whatever, technically because I didn't have the right software, the right hardware. It was because they just looked so uninviting and so unintuitive, and compared with my lived experience of having learned something that's directly related to this subject from a teacher by listening and copying and playing back, it just felt really crazy to me. And the more I tried, the more I got frustrated. And in the end, I actually just put all of the technical stuff, the technological stuff aside, and I just focused on learning the oud. I put myself into an ethnomusicology degree at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and I just tried to focus on my acoustic performance and expanding my knowledge. And I traveled around a lot, I studied a lot, etc. But my love for electronic music, for using these tools, was always there. And I would always come back to it and be frustrated and want to find ways to do things myself, and was never able to. And finally, a few years back, I decided to take the bull by the horns and actually do something. And so I spoke with a couple of programmers, and we started working on a Max for Live device. So most of you probably know what Max is. It's this coding environment for music making that was developed by a company called Cycling 74, which was recently bought out by Ableton and integrated now within Ableton Live. So we made this Max for Live patch that would allow me to tune any synthesizer I had access to in whatever way I wanted. And the day that I got the working prototype from this, my mind was completely blown, because I just felt like finally these sounds that that I enjoy have become accessible. I don't feel alienated by them. I don't feel discouraged by them. I feel like I can engage with them. And I was planning on making the tool publicly accessible, but as I started using it and started doing more research, I realized the problem with these tools is not the technology itself. And the issue at hand was not the need for a technological solution, because some things did exist in ways that were, at least for me, not quite suitable, but they still existed. And they were also very limited. And sometimes they ended up limiting you more sonically than the kind of freedom that they afforded you by allowing you to be able to play with these different tunings, etc. And with these realizations, I came to understand that what I was looking for was not a means to an end. And by that I mean, I didn't have this eureka moment of the lone genius composer who heard a magical melody in his sleep and then awoke the next night and, got it down on a piece of paper or programmed it into a computer. I was looking for the creative freedom that would allow me on any day to wake up, sit down in front of my laptop or using the tools that I have at my disposal and just play and explore in exactly the same way that I had developed a relationship with the oud, where I could at any time of the day just pick it up and play. and just explore anything, put my finger down anywhere and hear anything that would come out, play in any way, traditional, non-traditional, bang my head against it, whatever, you know. And this became incredibly important for me because I realized that all the tools at our disposal today were ultimately about a means to an end. They're a way of trying to render an intellectual perspective or idea accessible, and then to be able to play within the confines of that idea. Whereas for me, I wanted to be able to just be free and explore anything. If I had a melody in mind, I could do it. If I had a feeling, if I had a sound in mind, I could do it. If I was interested in a specific mode, a specific maqam that had a specific characteristic, I'd heard a song the night before, or I was in that particular kind of mood, I could just dive in and put my fingers down and hear it. And this was one of the main issues. The other one was that people really didn't understand, I think, and this was my impression, that the breadth of this topic, especially when it comes to the politics. And by the politics, I mean ultimately the supremacy of Western art music, the supremacy of staff notation, even though, you know, we all feel like we've gotten away from it, you know, by using some of these tools. I mean, like there's an analog rhythm up there by Electron and Moog Mother 32, and we all think that these are like, you know, liberating tools, but ultimately they're all based on the most fundamental, like, rigid elements of what staff notation allows, which is something that even in Western music has been completely torn apart to shreds, you know. Thinking about Earl Brown, John Cage, Cornelius Cardew, etc., all these composers that completely pulled apart the idea of performance instructions being written on a piece of paper, which is ultimately what staff notation was about. So when I realized that all these tools, no matter how crazy and wild they pretend to be, are actually just based on the most rigid concepts that are embedded within staff notation. And so this supremacy of Western art music and Western art music theory is what is ultimately, embedded and inherited within all of these different platforms. So I realized that rather than putting a tool out just to say, hey, this is a nice tool here that you can do all these kind of tunings with and explore these different ideas and have fun, wouldn't be enough as a contribution, because I had been suffering from this for 20 odd years, and I know many other people who are suffering from it. And so I took it upon myself to try and think about things a bit differently. And then I came across the work of Counterpoint, who are a phenomenal design studio that work with generative music. You might have come across a web presentation that Tero Parviainen made called How Generative Music Works, I think. If you haven't, you should look it up, and I'll try to throw a link in. Let's see if I can find it while I'm talking. When I saw Tero's presentation, which he presented at Ableton's Loop Festival quite a few years ago, I was taken aback because he was using the web browser exclusively for this presentation and all the different interactive elements that were embedded within it. And so I reached out to them with an idea, and I said, would you like to work with me on a tool that would allow for exploring tuning in the browser? And they were extremely excited. I managed to get a very, very humble amount of money from my university as part of my PhD, which I'm almost finished with. Superb. Thank you very much, Jake. The link to that presentation is in the chat. We set about, making this tool. And the reason why we're making it at this particular time is I'm doing a PhD in composition, which is practice-based. At the end of my PhD, I have to submit a portfolio of compositions, not a written thesis. And I was struggling to actually, the subject of the PhD is creating a repertoire of experimental and contemporary Arabic music. And it's very vague and wide-ranging for a reason, which is to allow me to explore acoustic, electroacoustic, electronic, methods of creation, but also to think about identity in a different way. There's a question about finding the full videos of the performances. So on my website, which there's a page dedicated to the Apotome project. I'm going to put that link in the chat. And at the bottom, there are links for everything. So you'll be able to, access the tutorials, access the tutorials, the user guide, all the different videos, the presentation that I showed an extract of, all of that stuff. All the links are in there. Thanks for asking. Where was I? I was talking about my PhD. Yes. So the idea was that I would try to explore different ways of creating this contemporary experimental Arabic music, but without losing its sense of identity. And what I found in my research was that tuning is really a core, fundamental element of identity, musical cultural identity. And if you played this, melodies in equal temperament, they lost something. I'm not talking about melodies that involve like very specific characteristic intervals of different musical cultures, but even the simplest melodies, they just lost something. And I realized that, this is really a core element. And so if I could preserve that element, I would be free to explore all kinds of compositional ideas, whether they be timbral, whether they be musicological in terms of pitch classes and rhythmic structures, whatever, because I would maintain somehow this sense of identity. And it's really, really easy to make the parallel with something like language and accent, dialect, to make the parallel with cooking when thinking about ingredients and spices. I've said a couple of times, in my view, 12-tone equal temperament is really the McDonald's of tuning, because it's just about convenience. And that's the only reason that it's been used. And ultimately, it's a theoretical construct. It's not even something that was, executed 100% in reality until we had the analog synthesizers, and then we had digital tools. And once the digital tools came into play, that's when we start to really hear 12-tone equal temperament. And I would bet any amount of money that if you take the recording of a jazz band from the 80s onwards who are using digital pianos, similar to the Nord that we hear today, and compare that to jazz recordings from the 60s, the 50s, the difference that you will hear, even the 70s, the difference is not only about the fact that they were using acoustic instruments and we are using digital instruments. It really is about the tuning, because that's what affects everything. Anyway, I digress. Why don't we just jump in? Yeah, I mean, I've talked a lot, but this is like the general issue here. And this political element of this subject was really important for me. And so I wanted to make sure that it was highlighted in order for us to be aware of it, because most people just really aren't aware. I noticed that there are a couple of questions here from Yannis in the Q&A. So I'm going to take those before jump across. So Yannis, you dabble in both analog and digital sound. Do you think the two mesh well? How do you make them work? Yeah, I think they do. It really depends. I mean, you can use a analog synthesizers alongside FM synthesizers and treat them in post-production in different ways, and you can find a warmth or a similarity in texture and color, or just highlight that difference in many different ways. I think if you listen to people like Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, bands like Nine Inch Nails, even Otecker, there's so many other artists, Plaid, they all use Clive Barker. They're all using all these different kinds of mixtures of digital and analog instruments. Yanis also asked, can you talk about the challenges of tuning comparing the vocal and the instrumental? Can the human ear perceive quarter tones which are more prevalent in Greek, Byzantine, and Middle and Near Eastern music? Well, I think that the only challenges really, Yanis, are to do with an instrument's ability to render those intervals. The voice can render any intervals. Ultimately, it's down to our knowledge and our experience and the kind of the library of aural references that we have in mind. The instrument is a different story because, it can be constricted by mechanical means or just the general construction of an instrument. So that's why you find most of the time in these specific cultures, the instruments are created in a way that allows for those explorations. Something like the qanun that allows for the levers to be lifted and therefore change the length of the string and access these different melodies. The oud obviously is fretless, so you can do whatever you like. Saz, tambour, all the other fretted instruments have movable frets, so you can adjust them according to whatever you like. And I think that's the relationship in terms of those two particular forms. Have you seen Byzantine, this is also by Yanis, have you seen Byzantine music notation, which is relative and not absolute like Western music is? Would that be more helpful to notate music and remember and codify what one played? I really love looking at notation systems from other parts of the world because they're incredibly powerful and mind-opening, and I think actually they were the direct influence of many of the graphic scores and ideas that we saw in the early mid-20th century onwards. So I don't know if you've ever seen something like Tibetan notation, which is absolutely stunning to look at in the way that it can express things way beyond what staff notation can, and way beyond what other like fixed pitch notation systems can as well. So I find those really, really inspiring and really beautiful. But ultimately, I really do think that one needs to find a way of writing down music if they want to write down. And I don't agree with writing down music because there have been oral cultures that have, lasted and musical works that have lasted the test of time by purely being oral and nothing more. So I don't believe, again, in this supremacy of the written in general, because I find it restrictive and I find it problematic. Even Western staff notation is not adept at rendering the nuances that are necessary for Western music performance. And today, I'm sure many of you have come across this, but it still shocks me when I hear ensembles performing music that sounds exactly like the playback from something like Sibelius or Finale or Dorico. And the reason for that is because it's very clear that the composers themselves have been influenced by the playback of those tools and have been led to create and write their music, to literally write their music, to type it in to these tools in a specific way, because they have been led by the tools and by the restraints of those tools, or by the way that those tools represent musical ideas. And when I hear an ensemble pretty much rendering the thing note for note exactly as a computer would, I think there's a problem here, because we are completely missing this extra element of trying to think about the musicality of a work and the representation of individual characteristics, whether they be from the part of the composer or from the part of the performers. Frank here says, I think you are wrong here. It became necessary because of the development of harmony and the concept of modulation. I'm guessing you're referring to 12-tone equal temperament. I'm not dissing the fact that 12-tone equal temperament exists. What I'm dissing is that it's the only thing that is available in all of the musical, in the majority, like 95, 98% of musical tools that we have at our disposal. And the fact that we don't have that choice, while at the same time, all of these tools are being marketed and presented to us as somehow democratizing music making, I think is a fallacy. It's a fantasy. Right? It's exactly the same thing as George W. Bush going around saying we're going to plant democracy all over the world, right? It just doesn't, it's not that, because democracy is about choice. And if you don't have the choice, then there's no democracy. And if you can't make an informed choice because you don't have the information, you don't have the knowledge, which is not necessarily your responsibility to go and find, it should be accessible at the very least, then I think there's a huge problem. And I would also actually argue against this concept with regards to the development of harmony and the concept of modulation, because ultimately what composers were trying to get away from were these wolf intervals, right? Which meant that if you tuned your harpsichord, let's say, your clavicembalo, your harpsichord to the the so-called Pythagorean tuning, which is not even Pythagorean, but we can get into that afterwards. This so-called Pythagorean tuning, you tuned it in the key of C, and you have your 12 chromatic notes. When you're in the key of C and you want to modulate to key signatures that are far away from that, you're going to find these intervals that sound dodgy, that don't sound as good as they should. So only certain key signatures will work. And so there's this desire to be able to modulate to distant key signatures without things sounding bad. And I would set you all a challenge to go and find me, like in the entire repertoire of Western music, right, Western art music composition from the 17th century onwards, how many compositions in percentage actually modulate to those faraway keys that are only possible in equal temperament? I guarantee you will struggle. And I haven't done that kind of research because it's not my specialty and I don't have the resources to do it. And I'm sure nobody else has either. But that's a big question that needs to be answered. Really, like, is this really necessary or not? Because any piece by Chopin, okay. I mean, I would disagree. I don't think any piece by Chopin. We need to do the research and find, I mean, I'm not going to sit and argue about it because I don't know. But I'm pretty certain that the percentage is going to be pretty low. And more importantly than that, digital tools that were supposed to allow us all of this freedom when they were, coming to light, because of their ability to allow for the changing between different tuning systems at any time, whilst not affecting what was already played. So you could play a chord in whatever 17-tone equal temperament, flip to something else, or play something in the key of whatever, C major, and then modulate to another key and have that new key be tuned to itself. That was all possible with the digital tools that became available because there was a thing called MIDI tuning standard that was ratified into MIDI in 1991. This is what I mean about this not being a technological problem. It's a problem of vision. It's a problem of understanding. It's a problem of perspective. And so when we could have had, resolved all these problems and be able to play in mean tone intonation, historic Western art music, and be able to modulate and change and retune to whoever anytime, all of this was the doors for all these opportunities were completely shut ultimately. And I can share with you a little audio recording by Wendy Carlos where she talks about this subject in a moment. So yeah, I think that ultimately the need for equal temperament was more so than not based on a frustration that there's this thing called the comma, which is if you take a perfect fifth of the ratio 3:2 and you do the circle of fifths, when you get round to the note that's supposed to be an octave, it's not quite an octave. And that interval, that difference between the last fifth and the octave is called a comma. It's called a Pythagorean comma today. And there's that comma has frustrated music theorists for thousands of years because nobody can understand why two perfect intervals such as the octave and the perfect fifth and the ability of the perfect fifth to take us through the entire chromatic gamut in terms of these, ascending chromatic notes, why they don't match up. And so the frustration is what caused all these other temperaments to come through, from whatever quarter comma, mean tone, etc., etc. And obviously there was a musical desire there too, right? There was a compositional desire. The instruments themselves were developing. I'll tell you an interesting story. A friend of mine was at the Instruments Museum here in Berlin, and they were doing a tour of all these historical European instruments. And the guide actually told them that the major development that happened in piano performance was directly related to the colonial import of ivory. And it was the ability to have ivory keys for the piano that allowed for Western art music and specifically piano performance to develop in this very virtuosic ways. Because before that, they were using wood, and the wood obviously has a certain weight and a certain way of reacting to itself that didn't allow for this kind of virtuosity that we ended up seeing. And so, these things go far deeper inside the roots of colonialism and imperialism than we like to, than we like to accept ultimately, I think. So, sorry, I went off on a tangent because of your questions there, but yeah, let's leave it there. Maybe we can take a couple more later.
Okay, I'm sorry. We just, maybe that was on my end, but it just froze for a moment.
Oh, sorry, you lost me.
Yes, but I think we're back. Where were we?
I was just saying that I digress and I'm going off on a bit of a tangent because of the question. So I'm going to stop there and take another question. Are there distinct, M. Edward asks, are there distinct Sephardic Jewish scales, or does Sephardic music use other scales? As far as I'm aware, it's difficult to think about those kinds of musics outside of their geographical context, because their geographical context is what gives them their identity. So Sephardic songs, as far as I remember, we're talking about the south of Spain, and so there's a kind of amalgamation of. Did I lose you guys again? Jake, you've frozen. Can anybody else hear me? Or
Yes, you're live.
I'm
Hi.
good. It's just Jake.
Jake is having some technical issues.
Okay, no problem. So I'll carry on. So yeah, I mean, obviously the influence of the Arab world on the south of Spain is well known because of the Arabs ruled that part of the world for many years in the Middle Ages. So I think those influences are always going to come from whatever the local culture is. Catherine asks, how do we break away from standard equal temperament when the MIDI standard is defined by equal temperament? Well, this is precisely the problem. MIDI actually allows for any tuning of any kind. All 128 MIDI notes can be tuned differently. You can tune and play something and then change your tuning, and the previous notes that are left ringing don't change. And this is a thing called MTS, MIDI Tuning Standard, and it was ratified in 1991. The issue is that manufacturers and developers most of the time chose not to allow those kinds of MIDI messages. And that's what has caused the problem that we're still in today in 2021, is that manufacturers didn't think that this was something that was necessary. And this is what I meant by 12-tone equal temperament being the equivalent to McDonald's. Is everybody sees the convenience. We have one thing, we set everything to 0, every single note, the tuning value of it is set to 0. We divide 1200 by 12, and that's it. And that's what everything is set to, and it's a standard. Everything's tuned to A4440, hurrah, it all works. We don't have to think about it anymore. And I think this was a complete disaster. And I'm going to share with you that extract from Wendy Carlos, so that you can hear somebody else give their opinion. I'm hoping that Jeffrey, we will get onto the demos, I promise. I'll do that in a second, but let me just share with you this It's a 3-minute clip of Wendy Carlos, who you might know from Switched on Bach, which was the first, big selling electronic music album that performed orchestral works or Western art music works, classical works. And I'm going to share with you this little clip so that you can hear her talking about it. So she made this album called The Secrets of Synthesis, in which she discusses many of her ideas for how to approach synthesis, from creating different kinds of sounds to using different kind of compositional techniques. And the last track on this CD is called Alternative Tunings, The Future. And I'll leave Wendy Carlos to present the rest in her own words.
But the rest of my excitement is that not only can we have any possible timbre, but these can be in any possible tuning. At last, it's possible to leave the limits of the equally tempered scale and use any form of tuning that might tickle our ears. How bad and good is our 12-note scale? Let's compare, on a basic organ stop, a sustained arpeggio, first in equal temperament. Now in perfect tuning. Here's a chord, first in equal temperament. Again, in perfect tuning. I should mention that by perfect tuning here, I mean an extended form of what traditionally has been called just intonation, but carried on up to the 13th or more partial. It's easier to hear the difference with high-pitched strings. First, 2 short chords in equal temperament. And in perfect tuning. Again, but longer. First equal tempered, then perfect. A perfectly tuned scale sounds similar to the natural scale on a horn. And from that you can certainly hear where the horn rip comes from. But for older Western music, the best way to tune is mean tone intonation. With a computer, it's simple to modulate anywhere, retuning as we go, and avoid all the wolf intervals, which was the only reason we ever gave up such a good-sounding scale in the first place. But the worst way to tune is probably this temperament of 13 equal steps. It's a good test of a tool's power that it can produce results as perfectly bad as that. The same tool will also allow us to write music in perfect tune, or copy the scales of Bali, Java, Tibet, India, or anything else we might imagine. It's a tool whose age has truly come. I can hardly wait for the next step.
Sorry, I meant to fade that out rather than cut it short like that. I mean, yeah, it was quite clear, I think, from Wendy Carlos's words there, what the possibilities were. Frank has made another comment in the chat and in the Q&A saying that it's just a matter of economics and most people would not be interested in such fine details. And I would disagree with you entirely, Frank. I've heard this argument a million times, not only from musicians and members of the public, but also from manufacturers themselves. And it's really, I mean, when was innovation not on the priority of any manufacturer's list, of things to do? Not only that, what we're talking about, this issue of MIDI tuning standard being made available in the tools that we're discussing today, does not require any extra money to be thrown into the development of a project. It doesn't require any other code to be developed. It doesn't require any other resources or hardware or anything like that. It's already in the MIDI spec. And so all it needs to be is activated. The devices just need to be able to receive that data. And the number of synthesizers, software and hardware that support MTS is really, really minimal. And that's why the majority of electronic music using non-equal temperament, non-12-tone equal temperament tunings has been really limited, both sonically and in terms of public reach. But look at somebody like Aphex Twin and the kind of hoo-ha that gets thrown around after him because he's doing works in non-standard tunings and things that he's created himself. So I really disagree, and I don't think that that's an issue in any shape or form. I'll carry on with the Q&A in a second. I just want to share the tools with you and actually show you what they can do, because this is what we're here for. So I'll share my screen again and let's dive in. So bye, Wendy. Thank you very much. I love you. She's great. Leimma. So you can access both Leimma and Apotome from this URL here, which I will throw into the chat right now. There you go. Like I mentioned, they're free, they're open access. You don't need to create an account or do any of that stuff in order to be able to use them, but there are certain features that can only be used with an account, and you'll see why. But there's no data that is taken. We don't store anything. I don't know how many people have used this since its launch. I know that we've had something over 600, 700 signups now, maybe more. That number was quite a while back, but we don't have any data on anybody, so don't be worried about creating an account. But all the information is in the user guide about that. Anyway, so we have two choices, and this is very, very important here. When you open Leimma, and the same with Apotome in a second, you'll see that choice is fundamental. Like, choice is the default. It doesn't give you equal temperament as a default and then say, hey, change it to something else. It says, what do you want to use? And I think this is really, really important to note, because this is where the biases and the non-neutralities and the kind of leading of tools is important to understand. So we can do things in either way. We can either select the tuning system from this database it's a kind of repository that I'm slowly adding to and developing. It's going to take time, and we need to try and gather some more people to help me, but you can do that. But to show you how it works, it's best to create a tuning system from scratch. And then before we do that, I'm going to ask Jake to perform a little task for me. So, Jake, you have your tape measure handy?
Yes, I do.
Fantastic. So, sorry, I lost my folder. I'm just going to bring it back. So, everybody knows that, or I don't know if you all know, but most of the time when we think about tunings, etc., we come across all these mathematics and all of these crazy ideas, and everything feels like it's very, very far away from us, and it's quite intimidating. But in my view, tunings can be also kind of fun. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to create a tuning system based on the lengths of Jake's body parts. So Jake, I'd like to ask you to pick any part of your body and measure it. We need at least 5 lengths. So your arms, your face, your legs, whatever, your feet, anything you like. So just give me 5 different measurements in centimeters, please. And we'll type them in together as we go along, and then we'll make a tuning system from it.
Okay. I guess let's use my face. That sounds kind of interesting.
Okay, cool. Go for it.
So what should I do? My full head length?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. I mean, you don't have to be precise. It's okay.
Okay. How about that?
Go for it.
21 centimeters.
Okay.
That's chin to hairline.
Perfect. 21 next.
And then so should I do like my mouth or
sure,
like a subset of that?
Anything you like, whatever.
Okay, my mouth is 7 centimeters.
7 centimeters. Okay, this is a bit personal. I'm sorry to throw you in, but
that's fine. Maybe I shouldn't have chosen my face.
Yeah. Something else? Nose to hairline. There you go.
Okay, sure. Nose to hairline is 14.
14. Okay.
And how about eyes?
Oh, sorry, I've been typing them in the wrong box. 21, 7, 14. 20. Let's do this properly. 21, 7. Yeah, go ahead with the eyes. No worries.
That was 12.
27, 14, and 12. Okay, so I'm just going to copy these over. And something else?
How about the width of my forehead? 20.
20, perfect. All right, so let's take these. So what we do when we create a tuning system in Leimma is the first thing we need to do is figure out the reference pitch. You all know this as being A4 equals 440. In many musical cultures, A4 equals 440 means nothing. 440 means nothing. 432 doesn't mean anything, etc. And in something like the Middle Eastern music culture, instrumentalists would in the past tune their instruments to the singer. And so it's a very personal and an individual experience. And so they would, a singer would come along and say, I want to sing in this particular mode with this as my reference pitch. And so everybody would tune to that. So here what you can do is pick any MIDI note, say B3, and then you can change that to any value. And the reason why it's like that is because it can help you then when you are mapping stuff. So if I choose C4, but I don't want it to be 261, I want it to be 200 hertz, then I can just do that and I can get on with it. So there we go. The next page shows you this ruler, and this is where you insert the divisions of your tuning system. So you can do this either by entering ratios. So that's perfect fifth. You can enter the cents, or you can break all the rules and just do something like that. I would like to do something based on Jake's measurements. So let's grab these here. 340 is our first. There we go. Beautiful. So that's our tuning system. It was that easy and that quick to make. If we want to adjust any of these, that's 454. Let's remember. You can click and drag, and I just got to remember to put that back. So now that's working. Here we're hearing an internal synth, but I'll show you about the MIDI output afterwards. You can import Scala files here, and you can export Scala files of the tuning. But the fun part is if we click next, then we see now the tuning system represented as a wheel because it's cyclic and it repeats across all the octaves. And here, just using the QWERTY keyboard, we can map these notes. Sorry, I had to use it. One of my keys is not working. There we go. My key's not working. There you go, Jake. That's what you sound like. And if I change, we can change the MIDI input to a hardware device. So I have a KeyStep Pro here. Nice. And then we can also set the MIDI output to go to any hardware. Here I'm going to use a virtual MIDI bus on the Mac, which is this IAC driver. And that is I'm going to choose MPE because that's the current best MIDI protocol that allows for really accurate tuning for sustained notes, etc. I'm going to calibrate the MIDI pitch bend range here, which for MPE is a default 48. And now if I go into I am still sharing my screen with you, yeah. Here we go into Ableton Live. I've mapped this to be in on virtual bus 1. And if I turn that on and I play, so now you can hear that tuning in Ableton Live. I'm using the wavetable synthesizer because that's the one that has MPE built in. There are a bunch of other MPE enabled synths now, so it makes life easy. And the beauty about this is that you can also play polyphonically. Right, and obviously you can throw in any preset. Obviously, you heard something. That doesn't sound like the tuning that we had, so obviously something's wrong there. And what we can see is that pitch doesn't have a pitch bend range associated in that particular preset, and this happens a lot, so you always have to be careful. Now we can hear it. So yeah, that's fun.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So you mentioned, mapping to the keyboard and also mapping to the KeyStep, which is like a piano keyboard style controller. I'm just thinking about how the software like allows you to break outside the biases of tools, and what controllers have you found useful for doing that?
I see no problem in using the piano keyboard MIDI controllers. And the reason why is twofold. One, there's a reason that there are 12 notes in the octave in the chromatic keyboard. And that's not just, because of Western art music and the keyboard and stuff. It's because of the circle of fifths and the idea that if you take a perfect fifth and you keep repeating it and bring whatever interval that you reach back down into the same octave, you'll ultimately get to 12 notes, and you'll not quite reach the octave because of this comma, but ultimately gives you this chromatic scale. And there's a misunderstanding, number one, that a tuning system is a scale. And this is particularly a Western perspective. So everybody talks about Harry Partch's 43-tone scale. And it's not a 43-tone scale, it's a tuning system. And the majority of his works use a subset of that set, right? So a tuning system is a set, and then your scale or mode, whatever, is a subset of that. And so if we think about something like the 22 Shruti system, Jake, I'm going to send you this in a private message, so that the nice thing about Leimma is you can just share URLs with people. So I'm not going to send it to everybody because this is kind of personal and it's you, but I'm going to send you.
Thank you.
I'll send you the link, and you can open that and play now in your browser. But yeah, if we take something like the Indian 22 Shruti system, you'll see that it has all of these divisions, but not all of these divisions are used at the same time. So I don't have rugs programmed in yet, but if we look at this here, immediately what we can see is the tuning system starts on here. I'm going to switch to display as ratios. It starts here on the 1-1, but this particular rug actually starts with its tonic here on the 9-8, a tone above. And so just by having this very simple information displayed, immediately we can have access to this info. But back to your question about the piano keyboard. Most musical cultures will never use more than 12 notes at any one time, 12 distinct notes in the same octave at any one time. The other thing to remember is that the piano keyboard was originally a mechanical device, right? It's a device, you strike the key, there's a little hammer, it hits a string. That string doesn't need, the key isn't tuned to equal temperament. The string doesn't need to be tuned to equal temperament, right? It can be tuned to anything. Therefore, I have no problem with using the piano keyboard as a mechanical device, as a trigger in some shape or form. All these other microtonal controllers that I've seen around, they're great. I mean, each of them has their pros and cons. The main con of all of them is, and I don't mean that as a pun, I mean it with intent, that they're so expensive, right? They're completely inaccessible. And obviously they're very limited production runs. So they're really for a niche, very niche audience that can afford those kinds of devices. Whereas, a standard MIDI keyboard controller, costs nothing and is available pretty much everywhere these days. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Where were we? I was showing some cool stuff that we can do with Leimma that you can't do with other tools. So as you saw here, straight away, we have this tuning system. It's 22 unequal divisions of the octave. We pick a subset. We can see what the tonic is and how it's mapped. You can visualize the note names in different solemnization. So this is the North Indian system. You can look at it in solfege. There's the Byzantine system. There is the Javanese system, etc. And this, for me, really makes a huge difference, because suddenly now I can see this information on its own terms. It's not being mediated by a Western perspective on tuning, microtonality, blah, blah, blah. It's on its own terms. It's represented with its ratio values. It's represented in the solemnization system that makes sense to that musical culture. And so here, what we can see is that musical cultures are being treated on an equal playing field, that all of them can be represented according to their own terms. Interesting things that we can do. For example, we can maintain this interval structure, which is, so here if we take this as being the first shruti, that's number 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the fifth shruti, or sorry, this is the fourth shruti, because we'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. If we maintain this interval structure, we can just grab this and shift it around. And so now we have the same interval structure and the same mapping, but it starts on a different note. So essentially we're doing a kind of modal modulation, right? Or a modal transposition. And here's where we get to this idea about musical freedom and experimentation. It just takes that tiny little movement and I can try something completely unconventional within whatever musical culture I'm working in. I do this all the time when dealing with Arabic tunings, and I find, variations on different maqams and constructs, things that are super weird, very strange and enjoyable for me. Like I mentioned, you can just copy paste the URL or bookmark it, and then you'll always be able to access it. If you create an account and sign in, you'll be able to save subsets as favorites, and then you can switch between them. So you can fix them all so that they all have the same reference pitch and go through them to try out different tuning systems with the same sounds, with the same reference pitches, whatever you want. I mean, there's multiple uses and it's really, really enjoyable. And then, like I said, you can also export Scala files and therefore import them into other tools to use. So what we need to remember here is that Leimma is a tool for exploration, really. It can be integrated into your workflow, but it's best used as something to explore and to try and find different ideas and different ways of working, and then take those ideas and start to execute them in different ways. Here we're supposed to be talking about generative music, which we haven't talked about at all. So I'm going to dive right into Apotome.
Hey, I'm so sorry. One question from the Q&A that I think is interesting. Philippe is asking, does the app allow for non-octave equivalent tunings?
Non-octave repeating tunings? No, it doesn't. And the reason for that is that the majority of tunings used across the world are octave repeating. Some might overshoot the octave and still repeat, but they are really a minimal amount. And because I was trying to focus specifically on this non-Western perspective on music making, I decided to not think about experimental Western tunings and non-octave repetitions in this first phase, because I wanted to highlight these particular issues. There are plenty of other apps out there that will do the non-octave repeating stuff. And whatever, all different kinds of equal divisions of the octave, etc., etc. But I found it important here as a political statement to not center those and to center all these other musical cultures that have been sidelined for a very long time. Ed, you're asking about how to connect Leimma to a DAW. As I mentioned earlier, you use this virtual MIDI bus, and there is a YouTube video that I made about how to connect Leimma or Apotome to Ableton Live 11, which has MPE, and you can find that on my YouTube channel. Just search my name in YouTube and you'll find the channel and you'll find the video.
I'll link to that video in the chat.
Cool, thank you. So Apotome, we've gone through all this tuning stuff and we didn't get here. So as an aside to Leimma being a tool for exploring tuning systems, I decided to create a generative music making environment because I did not want this project to be seen as Khyam is this Iraqi oud player who's trying to allow traditional musics to be played using modern synthesizers, right? This is not at all my goal. I want to learn the rules in order to break them. I want to be able to look to the future and imagine different kinds of things and experiment and explore, because that is one thing that has not been afforded to me by these tools for a very long time. And one great way for doing that, particularly when it comes to trying to counter our own conditioning and our own embedded biases and inherited knowledge that we might not be even aware of its problematics before critiquing it, is to use generative systems, in my view. And that's because generative systems can give you things that are completely unexpected, that go totally against the logic of any musical culture or, music theory, that go against the conditioning of your muscle memory if you're a performer, that go against your sense of aesthetics and taste on a personal level. They allow you to break free of many things, or they can also allow you to craft things into, certain specific ways. And that's why I thought a generative music environment was important. For me, it works also a bit like a kind of palate cleanser, right? Think about ginger and eating ginger in between your different types of sushi and maki and whatever. You cleanse your palate in order to taste something different. And I find using Apotome just to hear something that I wouldn't normally hear really, really refreshing and very vitalizing on a creative level, because then I start to have all of this influence that starts to kind of seep into my subconscious and inspire me when I least expect it. So the way Apotome works is by, it's a kind of track and module based system. So here we have track 1. The first thing you have to do to make anything work is to select your tuning system. So let's go for, let's just go for one of these Ibn Sina Persian tunings, and then you select your subset. For example, you can change the reference pitch here if you like. Let's go for 200 again. And so now that's set. You can, if there are different data available, you can see. So that's all in ratios. Here we are in sense, and that's the mapping according to MIDI note. One thing I forgot to mention before. Here, when you're in Leimma, you can assign roles for different notes. So the root will always be assigned a role, and this is purely visual here. So let's say you can assign primary and secondary roles. So let's say we want to map this, so that would be C, D, E, that's an F. Let's map this to an F sharp, for example. And now we can give this a role of secondary, and you'll see the color change. This is just visual here in Leimma, but in Apotome here you can use these probabilistic sliders to define which pitch classes are triggered, and so you can choose primary pitch classes or secondary pitch classes or none. Unfortunately, this is broken at the moment. This would normally choose any pitch class that hasn't been mapped, but that's not working at the moment. And then you can choose your rests, and these are probabilistic sliders, so they will all add up to a percentage, and that would be divided within the algorithm. You can also use actual degree weights. I don't know why this is buggy today, rather than the roles. So you can define specifically which degree weights are being used. And then here you choose which melodic intervals you allow. So that's the distance between one note and the next note. If you allow 0, then that means you allow the same note to be triggered more than once. If you allow 1, it means that it can go up by 1 or down by 1 in terms of the pitch classes that have been mapped. Force polyphony works when you have multiple tracks. If all of those tracks have force polyphony engaged, then they will never trigger the same note in the same octave at the same time. And this is really beautiful for exploring polyphony. Here are which octaves you want to work in. You can override the global time signature, and the interesting thing about the time signature here is that you can do additive. So if I do 3 + 2 + 3 + 2 + 2, then that will auto calculate, and it will create, if we use accents, it will create an accent on each of those beat groupings. So you can have, a nice, you know, a 9/8 is not a 9/8 across the board. It really means nothing if you say that there's a Turkish rhythm that's in 9/8 and there's a Latin American rhythm that's in 9/8, and therefore they're somehow have a relationship. That really means nothing. It's all about the beat groupings and the grooves that are involved in those things. So this is a way to try and explore some of that. I did a video for Fact magazine called Against the Clock, in which I explored some you know, this like additive time signatures and some nice tuning. So check that out if you're interested. It's a 10. You have 10 minutes to make a track, and I was using Leimma and Apotome to do that. Here you choose what your beat divisions are in terms of the rhythmic complexity of the MIDI notes, the MIDI data that's being triggered, and you can also use this Euclidean counter. I'm not a fan.
You can design beautiful marketing assets and.
Oh, that was you, Jake, trying to find the.
Yep, sorry, got some
YouTube video. No worries. I'm not a fan of Euclidean cycles because ultimately they function in the same way the equal division of the octave does. It's the equal division of time, and I'm not really a fan of that. But we decided to include it just because it helps generate something that's a little bit more musical very quickly, rather than dealing with bloopy and having to refine it down. So. Yeah, you'll see how that goes. A looper, basically, that captures the last 1, 2, 3, 4 bars of the data that's been generated and loops that for you. There's a randomized note delay using Perlin noise algorithm for how it's how it moves, which is very nice, very interesting. Keeps things feeling very a bit more natural. There's an articulation range, randomized as well, which allows you to choose whether a note should be triggered as full legato or staccato. This is really nice for doing ambient style stuff where you might have like long note length values, but you don't want them to be played for their full length as legato notes. So you can set everything to staccato, and therefore you're something like this 16th note, you'll get basically one note be triggered every 16 whole notes. So that's kind of interesting. And then randomized velocity range. All of these use the Perlin noise feature, and then we have a built-in basic synthesizer which has these simple waveforms and a simple ADSR envelope, simple filter with a frequency and resonance. And then we have a Car plus Strong algorithm, which is an algorithm to replicate the sound of a plucked string. We have 2 web audio modules, the Oberheim OBX web port. So this is an OBX that runs in the browser. And also the wonderful Dext, which is a port of the DX7. There's a bunch of presets. You can also manipulate them and they'll be saved. There's a couple more. So we have the Yoshimi synth, which doesn't have an interface, but it does have a big preset library, so you can only use what's there. You can't modify it, but at least it's there. It runs in the browser. And then finally, we have a bunch of LFOs that you can target different things. So these simple things that are in the track mixer, but also depending on what device you have loaded, you can access different things that you can control with the LFOs. And finally, if we use MIDI, we can send it to a virtual bus using MPE. Let's calibrate that quickly. And then that will be sent out. You can to Ableton Live, but you can also use these CC values in the LFOs. So that's kind of fun, but you don't need any other software. You can just run this in the browser. The other super fun thing that you can do is press randomize here at the top, which will literally randomize every single variable that's in there, and we'll just hear what that sounds like. So there we go. We have Car plus Strong, a bunch of stuff. I'm just going to hit play and let's hear what it sounds like. Nice. We have a delay here. I'm going to duplicate the track. I'm just going to turn the volume down. So you can see here now in the duplicated track, a lot of these boxes are grayed out. That's because they have follow track 1. And what that means is you can control all of the other tracks from track 1. So if I raise this now, you'll see it being raised there, etc., etc. So this is fun for being able to manipulate the same parameters across multiple tracks in different ways. I'm going to keep that there. And then let's do another one just for fun. And let's get these going. Sometimes while you're creating stuff, things go out of sync because, you press start at different times. So you can just press resync tracks and that will bring them all back in sync together somehow. Let's have a listen to this craziness. Now if we slow it down. Sounds quite pleasant to me, so maybe let's choose something that's a little bit unpleasant. We go to this enharmonic ancient Greek greater perfect system tuning, and we'll have a listen to what the Hyperdorian sounds like. Funky. So it sounds quite unmusical, right? But obviously that's the nature of generative systems. You need to craft it and figure out how you want to do things. The really interesting thing here that I really love is that all of your favorite subsets that if you were logged in and had saved them here in Leimma, they will show up here in Apotome. And if you click on one, then it will automatically change track 1. And so if you have all of your tracks for the tuning section set to follow track 1, you can jump between tuning systems and subsets, particularly subsets, in your favorites list on the fly while it's generating in real time. Because if you want to switch tuning system from here, there'll be a little lag between changing the tuning system and choosing the subset. And so by using the favorites, you can literally jump through different tuning systems at the same time. There's also a really fun thing here called sessions. And what sessions allows you to do is to create snapshots. I'm just going to sign in quickly so that you can see how that works. Sorry, just 1 second. I can never remember my passwords, so let's just jump in as a user. So here I'm going to create a new session. You can give it a name. And then whatever snapshot, whatever values you have set up at that time, your tracks, their outputs, all the different variables inside, you can save that as a snapshot. So now I can press randomize again, and everything's going to change. Let's just wait for that, sorry. And then I'm going to capture that. And now if I press start, I'll go back to the first one. I'm going to turn it down a bit so I can speak on top. Watch this now if I jump to snapshot 2. Okay, we hadn't listened to snapshot 2. There's too many rests. Let's just get this moving in a little bit more of an interesting way. So I'm going to save that, capture and overwrite. Now we go back to our first one. You see the tuning is changing, all the parameters are changing. This is because all the octave weights are so crazy. Sorry, let's get rid of all the longer ones because that takes forever and just do shorter ones. So, like I said, it sounds quite unmusical because nothing there has been, refined. But there's another great thing that once you've created a session, if you save it, you can submit it to the community. And if you go to community sessions, you'll see a list of sessions that have been created by different people. The sessions come to me so I can just double check that they're going to run independently on their own as Generative works. And then once I've just checked that they work, if there's any problem, I'll send you an email or I'll fix up any little things. And then they can be there within this community pool, let's say. So let's open up Wet Dream by Dami Egebiemi and have a listen to what that is. And for some reason we can't hear it because all the volumes are set to 0. See, this is a problem of the preset, but this is something that somebody made. You can see that there are, sorry, I'm just going to turn this down. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different tuning systems being used at the same time with different subsets. The only problem is that, some of these values. So you can see these snapshots. You can set their settings to change automatically depending on the length of time or a length of bars measures. And so this is an auto-generating piece of music that will auto-generate and play through the specific structure until it ends. Let's see what else there is.
Do you mind? I have a quick question. Unfortunately,
Sure.
We're just about out of time.
Yeah. Okay. Stop.
But I would love if you could talk a little bit about how you structure a live set with Apotome. Is it mostly by using these the kind of presets and things like that?
Normally I think about what I want to do. So let's have a look at this. This is Chronotopia. I did a show in Athens at the beginning of October based on ancient Greek tunings, and let's load this up. What I did for this project was I wanted to run through all of the different tetrachords of the greater perfect system ancient Greek tuning in the chromatic, diatonic and enharmonic variations. And so I created a bunch of tracks that, there are how many tracks we have here? 16 tracks, and they are all set to output MIDI via MPE.
Mm-hmm.
That would normally go to Ableton. Let me see actually if I have the session here. I might be able to just load it up for you. Athens, we want, why is Chronotopia not there? Let's have a look. Chronotopia take 5. There we go. Okay, let's load that up. Don't save. Now this should, actually, I was using some controllers. So what I did for this project, let's just go through it. I created all of these tracks. They all go into Ableton. Some of them, so for example, we have multiple tracks. They all go to the same MIDI track. So these 4 tracks, they all go to the same MIDI track on IAC driver bus 1 in order to create chords and this like polyphonic things. And then the rest are all different tracks. They're all changing. And so what I did was I set it up so that for each fixed number of bars, the snapshot would change and cycle through all of these different tetrachords, all these different subsets, right? With specific degree weighting and specific octaves and blah, blah. And all of that data was going into Ableton Live. And then I had a MIDI, this is my session here. And then I had a MIDI controller where I controlled which track was being heard at what time. And I had a couple of auxes that I was sending things to. And so what I was essentially doing was arranging the MIDI data that was being run live. And I'll just show you a quick extract of that now. If we go back to the sessions and I just press play, then it will just start running on its own, as if I'm doing the live performance. Sorry, my CPU is struggling because it's set to a really short 128 samples. Yeah. Let's just get that up. Okay. This should be better now. So if I turn this up, Actually, these drones are absolutely gorgeous. Have a listen. And so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really beautiful.
You're welcome.
Someone's asking in the chat if that was recorded. Is there a way to see that?
It was, and I just literally wrote to the festival today saying, please send me the recording. So I don't have it, unfortunately. I'm waiting for it to come.
We'll keep an eye out for it then.
Hopefully, yeah, the performance was quite nice, actually. But if I'm not happy, I don't remember the details of it, but yeah, something of some sort from this particular thing will be released at some point.
So I have one last question, just kind of following up on seeing your setup.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop the screen share just to.
Oh, sure. So when you're performing in this way, where you're kind of live arranging, live mixing, with the software, like sort of improvising, do you find that do you kind of pre-plan where you'll go with it, or is it very improvisational?
It depends. This particular piece was really structured because I knew I had a fixed amount of time. I knew I wanted to get through all of these different tetrachords, so I had to pick a tempo and find, lengths of measures that worked, that allowed for this kind of cyclic thing to grow, and give myself the pre-created sounds and ideas that would allow me to develop an interesting structure, an interesting form for the performance. Whereas the live show that we did for CTM at the launch of the project, which I showed a little clip of at the beginning, which is available on YouTube, I literally set that up in an hour and a half before we went live. So I chose, the modes based on what I was in the mood for that particular day. I checked that the tuning works with every single person in the group. I gave them absolute freedom to create their own sounds and to find ways of manipulating those sounds. And we agreed on a couple of simple things, like Tyler Friedman would deal with the low end, the bass stuff, because I know Tyler and we have a rapport, so it makes it easier for me to be able to send information that helps ground the entire thing. I agreed with Enyang, who was to my right, that I would send her these kind of fast-paced melodic lines, so she should have something with a short attack or a very fast attack and a long release time, so that things could build up. These simple things. But when we performed, all I had was a few different modulations, like melodic tuning-based modulations that I wanted to go through, and a very, very vague structure in mind, and then we just improved through the whole thing. So I was improvising the musical content that I was sending to them via MIDI, and they were improvising the textural content, which obviously feeds back into each other, because if I'm sending you a bunch of low notes, then you need to react to those low frequencies coming out of your instrument in a different way than if I was sending you long sustained high notes, for example. So it's really been fun exploring these different things, and sometimes it can be very challenging and really hard, actually, but it's really fun, and it's nice to just kind of turn the fire up under your seat every once in a while.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that idea as a way to improvise. It's really interesting. I've never thought of doing something like that.
Yeah.
So, Khyam, thank you so much. This was really incredible. Is there any plugs you want to have at the last minute, links or anything like that? No, just, stay in touch. I'm trying to get off social media, to be honest with you. So if you're interested in keeping up with my work, I recently started a Telegram channel, and obviously there's the email newsletter, but obviously, feel free to follow on social media and whatever, but I'm trying to stay away from it as much as I can. And lastly, my email address is on the homepage of ishartum.net, where you can access all of those things. So please, have a look at the tools, check the videos, the tutorials, whatever. If you have any questions at any time, please just reach out to me via email, and I'll do my best to answer your questions and stay in touch. And if you do end up using these tools, please let me know and send me recordings or links or whatever, because it's really great to see how people use some of these ideas. I'm happy to stop now, or we can quickly run through some of the questions. It's up to you. Yeah, sure. We could do some questions. Sure.
Let's do that quickly. How did you settle on using MIDI as your control protocol? Was it because of how widespread it is? Would you consider expanding this project as an open source protocol like OSC? Yeah, most definitely. But the idea was for using MIDI here was to also highlight this thing that, tuning does exist in MIDI, but it's just not being utilized. OSC is great, obviously, we all know, but the majority of musical tools these days are all using MIDI, so it just made sense to try and deal with that primarily because of its accessibility and its wide range. But there are plans to expand on both Leimma and Apotome. There's some great ideas for things to do, so hopefully that will happen in the near future once we can find some money, basically. Sam is asking, hi I'm loving this talk. One question with regards to the issue of how to avoid a situation where our tools strip the cultural context from the tuning. I'm wondering what your thoughts on this are. Well, these are my thoughts as I've kind of expressed throughout the talk today, which is that we need to try and maintain the choice. I'm not a traditionalist, and I'm not a preservationist, and I don't believe that everybody in the world should stop using equal temperament and use something else, but I do think that we need to bring in the choice, because the lack of choice is what has really been detrimental to music making across the world, not only in terms of popular music and pop music production, also in terms of how sensitive audiences' ears are today, and also in terms of the possibilities of different musical cultures that haven't been explored specifically because these tools don't allow for these choices. So I believe in choice more than anything else. Estevan's asking, what can we do to convince manufacturers to update their software and support more tuning options? Just write to them. I mean, this is really the most we can do. Tag them in social media and write to them and say, hey, I heard about this thing and this is a problem, and please deal with it. And hopefully if there's enough of a buzz, then it will make a difference. There was an article written about this project in Pitchfork magazine, the headline of which was "Decolonizing Electronic Music Starts with Its Software." And this caused a big hoo-ha on Facebook and a bunch of other social media channels, and a bunch of software companies got wind of it, and I spoke to a bunch of people. Sadly, nothing is probably going to come out of it, but at least it brought this subject into people's minds. I'm giving a presentation at the Audio Developers Conference in London next week, again to talk directly to developers and say, listen, there is a problem of cultural asymmetry in music technology, and we need to start resolving it, because it's just not on that we continue like this, So that's what I'm trying to do. Estevan's always also asking, do I ever use Max MSP in your workflow? If so, do you ever share projects? I don't know how to code, unfortunately. So I work with people who code in Max, and I've used Max a few times in different projects, but they're not the kind of projects that I would be able to share online, unfortunately. So hopefully soon. I'm trying to learn myself. Do I teach any music theory courses open to the public? Unfortunately, not yet. I'm in the final stages of my PhD, so I need to try and get my head down and finish that. That's due to be submitted at the end of March. Once that's done, we'll see what happens. I might try to, open some kind of online course through Patreon or, whatever, just a general one-on-one thing. But feel free to hit me up in the meantime. If you have any questions, man, I'm always, willing to talk about this subject and share my knowledge and share my ideas as much as I can. And I don't charge anybody for it, because I think this is for the greater good. So feel free to get in touch if you need anything. Ella's asking, can you speak to the software engineering choices that went into making such a fully fledged audio environment run within the browser? Very quickly. So like I mentioned before, choice was really a principal thing. We did talk a lot about how intuitive the interface can be, how easy it can be. You shouldn't have to do any menu diving. I mean, you noticed I didn't dive into a single menu. Everything is available to you pretty much right there in the interface. This was a key thing. So how to properly represent the data in order to create some kind of cultural context was a major thing. How to keep the flow and the information refined, straight to the point, which was a big anticlimax for a lot of people, I think, because most people tend to try and use tuning and microtonality and all this other weird stuff because it makes them feel, because there's so many hurdles to get anything to work, it makes people feel good about themselves, like they really achieved something. And when you actually take all of that junk out and you make things easy and accessible, a lot of people just go, oh, right, is that it? Then I'm not interested. So, unfortunately, this is a byproduct of having something so simple. But these are essentially the main engineering choices. Obviously using the browser, accessibility, ease of use, and the lack of having to rely on installing things. Now if we update something, we know everybody's going to be using the same version, etc., etc. So these are the kind of reasonings. And Catherine is asking, will these music tools ever be open sourced, even if under a strict license? I don't think they will. That's specifically because there really is no need. They really bear themselves, like, they're there, and they're all written in JavaScript, so it's nothing really complicated. Everything that you need to know is either on screen or it's in the user guide. There's nothing weird going on behind the scenes. There's no hidden algorithmic stuff that's going on. It's all there for you to see. So it's about trying to understand the logic of these tools rather than trying to understand the way that they've been coded, because that's the key here, is what's the logic behind them? How do they work? How do they interact with the user, and what kind of information do they represent in which way? I think that's what needs to be what needs to be looked at more than anything else. And the last one before we have to go, because I have a flight at 6:30 tomorrow morning. Have you found any interesting hardware sequences or tools that allow for microtuning and overall more open workflow without a computer? The best thing that I've come across is a modular Eurorack module called Microtune, so a little U tune by Tubotech, and I'm going to share a link to that with you because I think it's absolutely amazing. These are made here in Berlin by a great mind. His name is Tobias, and they basically not only allow you to load up a Scala file and then use that to tune your oscillators, it also works as a MIDI to CV converter. So what we did for the live show, for example, was send the MIDI data from Apotome into Utune and then use Utune to convert that to CV data, specifically because it has one amazing feature, which is that it can auto-correct the tracking of your oscillator in real time. As if any of you use Eurorack, you'll know that most oscillators track really badly across different octaves, which means that, you know, your fundamental pitch in one octave will not be the same in an octave, you know, or 2 or 3 or 4 above, or sometimes even less than that. And what Utune, Microtune can do is, sorry, I'm just gonna put that in the chat, in the Zoom chat here. This is a link. What it can do is track your oscillator. It can send CV data out, all this kind of stuff. It's really great. At the moment, they're sold out. He's waiting for a new bunch to be made. There was a big interest following the launch of Apotome in this subject, and he sold out of the remaining units. So that should be coming soon. But that's the best thing that I've found. The other things, after we launched Leimma and Apotome, a company in England called Odd Sound, ODD Sound, released a plugin which had been developed in collaboration with Aphex Twin to try and deal with this problem of tuning across all different kinds of hardware and software devices. And that plugin is called MTS ESP. I'm going to share a link to their website here. I have some problems with the way that the way that it's set up and the way that it works, but it's the greatest tool out there so far because it allows for a bunch of different things in a very intuitive way, and it works with both software and hardware. There's a free version where you can throw in a Scala file and do your thing, or the paid version is about $100, €100, and then that allows you to manipulate and create things inside or wherever. But I would suggest as a start, use Leimma to create and explore, export the Scala file, dump it into the free version of MTS ESP, and then have fun using that, because I think that's the easiest way that really doesn't cost you anything if you already have Ableton Live, for example. But you could also use something else. Maybe you have GarageBand that allows for VST plugins, or anything else that allows for VST plugins, and you could use the free version of MTS ESP. That was pretty intense. Thank you very much, everyone, for all your questions and for getting stuck in. It just makes it really, really enjoyable, because, you know, I don't, even though I can't see you, I don't feel like I'm just talking to my computer. So, and thank you very much, Jake, for being there the whole time and for being a good sport with the tape measure.
Thanks so much, Khyam. This was really inspiring. I'm so excited to, use these tools even more. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I just want to remind you all that our next event is on December 11th. I'm going to pop a link in the chat. You can register for the next one. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Khyam.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good. Ciao.